Yo, what's going on, guys? Night Stranger back on the channel. Today, I'm going to start off asking you a very genuine question. Are you smarter than a chimpanzee? Because if you aren't, I suggest you read this book called Factfulness. And if you are, please click the top link in the description below and do the quiz. Then you come back and tell me whether you are or not. So, for those who want to learn, today I'll be presenting the book called Factfulness. And I will teach you how to view the world. Because I feel like a lot of us, from the time we were brought up by all the social media, by all the news, all the selective reporting we see in the daily world right now, our view of the world is actually really corrupted. We don't see the world how it really is. We don't use facts, graphs, or figures. The only thing we use is rumors and gossip and all these things, right? Dramatizing the things we actually see. The point of this book is not to downplay anything that's happening in the world right now. Everything is reported for a reason, right? But the point of this book is to use facts, data, and figures to find out how the world has been getting better and better and better throughout the past 100 years, 200 years, millennia. The world has been getting better because of technology. The world has been getting better because of the amount of scientists, right? And that's what the book really wants to tell us. This book is quite simple. It's one of the simplest books that really informed me about how the world really works. So that's why today I'm sharing with you. So the structure of my book review today, I'm going to talk to you about 5 instincts out of the 10 that were mentioned in the book. I think that these 5 are the core 5 instincts that we really need to control when we look at the world. And I'm going to go in depth into all of these, right, using the questions from the questionnaire that you definitely did. And I'm going to truly explain right now what it means to be smarter than chimpanzee. You see, in the questionnaire below, there's 13 questions, right? And each question, there's A, B, and C choices. So the idea is that you look at the question, you answer the question, and you get an answer, right? And most of these questions, only 20% of the people answered it correctly. That's crazy. Only 20%. It's a multiple choice question. If you choose blindly, you would get 33% of the questions wrong. That means people are deliberately not understanding, misconceptualizing the world. The same idea applied for a chimpanzee. If you give a chimpanzee 3 bananas, imagine this guy's on the tree, right? You'd be like, oh, let me choose 3 bananas for you, labeled A, B, and C. My guy comes down from the tree, he picks a banana, A, B, or C, as the choice for the question. He would get it more correct than most of you guys. Not to flex, I did get quite well on the test. I'm not going to tell you how many percent, but I did do like more than better than like 80% of the people, so, you know. But this book still taught me a lot. This book taught me so much. And yeah, I really hope today's presentation, today's book review, today's face-to-face talk with you, you know, would help you understand the world as it really is. Cheers, because I'm in a coffee bar right now. Hi. The first, I'm going to talk about the gap instinct. You might ask me, what the hell is the gap instinct? Well, it means to go to extremes with generalizations. Now, imagine you're in a classroom. I'm going to be Hans Rosling, the author of the book, right now. And rewind the clock. It's 1995. You're sitting down in my classroom, and I'm giving you a talk. Now on the screen, you would see 4 numbers. 35, 242, 14, 93. You'd be like, what the hell? Why are there 4 numbers? Are we learning maths? No, we're not learning maths. We're learning about the world today. As a general misconceptualization, we would like to see the world as really divided, really poorly managed, really poorly run, right? We would like to see the world as, like a lot of people see the world as very negative. We don't think that the world is developing. We think that the world is going backwards on itself. And a lot of things that like the news media tells you is completely that. But let me tell you a simple fact. 35 is the number in 1995 that deaths per 1,000 infancies in Saudi Arabia. 242 was the number in 1960. Imagine that decrease. That's absolutely mental. From a 24.2% infancy death rate in Saudi Arabia, it went to 3.5 in the matter of 35 years. In the matter of 35 years. That's almost 1% a year. That's crazy. The world has been getting so much better with healthcare, with people actually caring about, like, you know, the contraception, you know, stuff like that, just medicine, hospitals, like childcare, you know, like even like the milk that the baby drink is specially designed. You know, the world is improving so much. The number 14 was same idea. The number of deaths per 1,000 infancies in Malaysia right now in 1995. Roll the clock 35 years back, the number was 93. So in the same amount of time, Malaysia went from 93 to 14. There's a 1.4% death rate. That's crazy. Imagine 1,000 babies, they're born, right? Only 14 die. That basically illustrates how Malaysia went from a difficult economy to like a really flourishing one. The fact that 986 babies survived meant that, you know, the world is getting so much better. And that's my first message for you. The world is getting so much better in the book. Now, point number 2. As a person who lived in Europe as well as Asia, I want to say that this is quite appropriate. I would say that this is quite appropriate. Because in Asia, you really understand that the world is no longer divided. It's no longer the West and the rest, right? It's more like the West is doing well, the rest is also doing well. But it's commonly a misconceptualization. We would think, like in the West, as I'm brought up here as well, right? I would see that a lot of people might think that, you know, the rest is still developing countries, undeveloped countries, very rural areas, but that's totally not true. We have megacities as well, right? Then, right now, to prove my point, I want you to look at this graph on the page right now. Right, you may say, like, crazy, right? But that's how the world is, right? There's developed and developing people, right? And this is shown through a very telling graph. It's about numbers per baby and like children, infancies. Yeah, children like dying by the age of 5 or something like that. So, like number of infancies and children dying before 5, this is really a telling graph about how a country's economies really work, right? Because if you can afford to have less babies, you would. And if you can afford to have less babies dying, you would, right? But the thing is, could you tell me what's wrong about this graph? And if you can, good for you. Because this graph was from 1950. Let me repeat that. This graph was from 1950. This is the time when most of our parents, of our grandparents grow up. Or maybe you yourself. I'm not saying that you might be 70 years old. Right? There's nothing wrong with that. But, you know, that time, that's how people looked at the world. It was the West and the rest. That was completely true, right? The developed country has less babies and less baby died. The developing countries has more babies and more babies died, right? Now let me put you with the graph around the screen right now. This is what the world is right now. 2017 data shows that most of the world is in the developed nations. If you calculate using the same bars, there's really not that much difference, you know? And that's absolutely mind-blowing. If you calculate by one of the most effective metrics for determining the prowess of an economy, you can't. You can't differentiate because the world has been getting significantly better. Especially for the Eastern countries who were perceived as poor economies. They don't have large workforces with poor pay. That's a generalization. That's the gap instinct. You might think as a Westerner that there's a gap between the Western and Eastern countries. But that's not true right now. It's becoming less and less of a gap and more of like a steady trend. Right? That's how most of the world works right now. As you might find like some questions in the questionnaire, it was like one I remember, it was like what percent of the world live in low income, middle income and high income, like where are the population situated? The answer is middle income. It's not low income. Most people live in middle income, 80% of the people, whether rest or west. Right? That's crazy. Right. Bingo. Misconceptualization 2. Destroyed. Right. So next point, I really want to address the idea, the concept of developed, developing, and undeveloped. Because what Rosling said in this book, which was so telling, was that the world couldn't be categorized into 3 categories only. Because through like the developing nations, right, it's really not like they're doing that bad, but we don't see how like some higher middle income and low income, middle income countries are actually categorized. So I have like a graph right there on the board right now. And it really just justifies my point about middle income countries, right? How they dominate the majority, because that's really how it works. Only 1 billion of the people live in extreme wealth. That's level 4. And only 1 billion people live in extreme poverty. That's level 1. Most of the people live somewhere in the middle, right? 3 billion live in level 2. 2 billion live in level 3. And you look, these are the basic lifestyles of like people who live in these areas, right? And I'm expecting you, if you're from a level 4, right, because you're watching this video, it's more likely that you're from a more privileged background. I would want to say that, you know, there's really not that much of a gap between you and other people. It's really that, you know, there's a lot of people living out there who are level 2, level 3, and they're trying to get to level 4 and all of that. And the world's really not as divided, not as like developed, developing and undeveloped, but more like level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4, you know? There's still like an economic hierarchy, but it's less defined. It's more nuanced than just, you know, the things we were taught in school. And I really want to address that. I think, you know, it's a common misconceptualization. 1, 2, 3. Boom. Right. Last, I want to sum up the gap instinct, right? What better way to sum up the gap instinct than pose question 1? Let's put question 1 on the board right now. All right, question 1 states, what percentage of girls comes from low-income countries that finish primary school? I'm paraphrasing this. A, 20%, B, 40, C, 60. That is a thought-provoking question. I remember I probably got this wrong. I probably put 40. Like, I was ignorant. I still am. I'm still so ignorant, right? I know that I know nothing. But it's crazy that, you know, the world views low-income countries as really, really undeveloped, right? They're really, really poor. Which is, okay, it's a generalization because most people still can go to school. Most people still finish primary school. It's the very basis. You finish primary school at like 11, 10, right? Like, girls do get their education. It's very broadcasted in social media that all these girls don't have education. Sure, in like Afghan countries and Muslim countries, that might be the case for a minority, right? It's not like completely true that they don't get any education. It's that they don't get further education. That's the key thing. And we applied our knowledge about them not going to high school, them not being able to attend university to whether they can go to primary school or not. That's a stereotype. The answer is 60%. And guess what? Let me put up another graph right here. If I do have another graph. If I don't, just, it's blank. That only 7% of the people are smarter than a chimp. Or maybe not even. Only 7% of the people answer this right. Wow. 7%. Hans Rosling conducted research in like the biggest institutes in the world. I remember he went to like some massive university like Yale or something. He asked the students there, right? He went to some like scientific institution where scientists really like dive deep into like the doctors and everything. Like they're so like mad, right? They don't know this. 7% are from the most elite people in the world, right? That's absolutely crazy. So, boom, misconception gone. The world is better than what it is. There's no gap. It's only a steady trend upwards. Right. Now let's go on to number 2 of the instinct. The negativity instinct. Okay, right. Definition, what does it mean? It means to feel bad about the world. And you might ask, like, isn't it natural to feel bad about the world? But if you're trying to back up your statements from facts and figures, I can tell you why this came to be. Why a lot of people have a very negative worldview. Like, people are always saying, oh, you gotta recycle, you gotta do this, you gotta do that to prevent climate change, you gotta stop using the heating, like stuff like that. Like, you're urgent. Like, it's like there's no point having that fear right now, right? It's bad, but we still have time to change, right? And there's no like, oh, it's gonna happen, like the doomsday is gonna come, right? Everyone thinks the doomsday is gonna come in like 50 years. That's not true. It really comes from selective reportings from journalists. This book does not warn you from not reading news. It warns you from identifying selective reporting. Journalists would only select like the worst type of media, like the worst trends, right? To get people fearful, right? To spread the word, oh my God, climate change is going to kill mankind. And they might not be wrong. The main thing talked about in Factfulness is that they might not be wrong, but they're only selectively reporting the bad things to emphasize their point. Isn't that what everyone does? You do research, but you only do research that really backs your point. It's very simple. They selectively report. So the worldview we are fed by these journalists are negative. And it forces us to have a negative instinct about the world, but really, it's not that bad. So you might be asking me, how do we rationalize it? How do we approach such a negative, like, conceptualized world with our own positivity, right? I think the main point stated by Factfulness was that, I'm going to read it out, by accepting that the world could get worse and better. It's like a football match, right? If you're a football fan, like, I'm gonna use the example, right? I'm a Barca fan, and like, Barca drew 2 days ago, and like, that was our third draw, right? It was bad, but as a football fan, you kind of have to accept that the results go up and down, but the trend is normally up, as Barca is a good team, right? Like, you have to accept when it comes down, because you can't win every game, but you can win the majority. And what the journalists are telling you is that times when it went down, right? Definitely it would attract much more people to see how Barca lost points than how Barca gained 3 points, because 3 points are so normal. It's became a norm that it's not reported. And also, by not only focusing on the positives, but see what the negatives are, what makes the positives possible, right? Because if we don't have dips in our form, we can't eventually earn more points. We can't have the comparison. Because if we're going up always, right, like there'll be nothing new, right? It's only the negatives, the dips, that make the upward trend possible. That's a fact. you know? It's impossible to keep on going upwards. And negative things benefit the positive outcome, right? It changes so many things. In football, like a negative thing changed the mentality, you know, like they gotta fight for the title, right? You know? If you don't lose, how do you get that mentality? How do you go to the very end competing, right? It's just stuff like that. And I think it's very important to focus on the fact, focus on the data, focus on the figures that we can genuinely analyze before we make a rash decision. Oh my God, the world's gonna end. So yeah. All right, so how do we summarize this point? I'm gonna use question 3. Each section, I'm gonna talk about question, I'm gonna address it with what we just learned, and then we're gonna abolish the misconceptualization. So question 3, boom, on the board right now. In the last 20 years, the proportion of the world's population in extreme poverty has A, almost halved, B, stayed the same, C, almost doubled. And I think I got this one right, actually. I think I actually got this one right, yo. So the answer, as you well know right now, is almost halved. But guess what? Only 10% of the people got that correct. Because what we are really fed with like UNICEF right now, with like the World Health Organizations, you know those advertisements that you have of like Bangladeshi children, like they can't have food. The book tells you that it is extremely true that they don't have food, but the journalists are specifically trying to implement these very selective reportings to exaggerate the problem. Not exaggerate, okay, not the word exaggerate the problem, but to portray the problem with intensity, with focus, right? As it would not like portray any other problems. It takes advantage of our sympathy, of our empathy. And yes, they are doing a great job, but this book is all about facts, right? It's all about factfulness. It's not a word. Factfulness is not a word. It's fact, then full, then ness, like emphasizing a fact, right? Then basically, the idea of this book is that you got to really look at the data. Has extreme poverty really increased? No, it hasn't. Because of the WHO, because of UNICEF, it's getting a lot better. But because of these selective reportings, we are only receiving the negative outlooks on what is genuinely happening in the world. And that's a problem, because we all think the world is going to collapse. There's so much extreme poverty that in the next 20 years, like half the world is going to be in extreme poverty. No, that's not true. It's decreasing. And I think that's very important to understand, that it really is decreasing. Bro, I actually hate cutting my videos. So people just banged on the door of their cafe. Bro. Alright, yo, we're back to my place. And, right. I think I basically explained the negativity instinct quite well. And now we're gonna jump into what I think is the most impactful instinct. It's the fear instinct. And okay, what do you mean, you may ask, right? It means to fear the world. As simple as that, to fear the world as it is. We shouldn't. I'm going to tell you why we shouldn't, through Hans Rosling's book, Factfulness. Now let me tell you a story. Imagine that you're working in 1988 in this hospital in Sweden, and you see a pilot sometimes like got shot down, and he comes down and he's injured and he's waffling and his mouth is frothing, his eyes are turning to the back of his skull, and he's like limp. It's like, oh my god. It's like, and you're the doctor, you're supposed to cure him, and you're just like trying to say, oh, you're trying to speak to him, he's like speaking all sorts of random gibberish because you're like so fearful, you're so concentrated, you're like, oh my god, I have no clue how to deal with this patient. And then again, then you black out. Then you're like, oh my god, I just black out because of this patient. Right. Okay. That was Hans Rosling's real story. And what is the moral of the story? It's to concentrate. It's to not be fearful of what you see in front of you. Hans Rosling later illustrated in the book that he thought it was a World War II pilot, and actually World War III started. Because of such a thing back in the day about world wars, about like Soviet Union, America, like the tension, like all the tension we got from the news media made Hans think that the World War III started. That's so powerful. Wow. Imagine sitting in the hospital in 1988 thinking that the World War III started. Turned out the pilot was actually Swedish. He was actually speaking Swedish. It was because Hans was so like in the moment that he couldn't comprehend what he was trying to say. And the pilot did get saved in the end, but it's such a jarring story to tell you how when we are fearful, we don't think correctly. We don't think right, and that may put us in a certain amount of danger. Alright, so what did Hans Rosling use to describe fear in his book? A lot of people, he asked, what are the things they are most afraid of? And they would think about like snakes, spiders, height, and always being trapped in small spaces, right? Always being like physical harm, such as violence caused by people, animals, sharp objects, or forces of nature. They would also say stuff like captivity, right? Entrapment, loss of control, loss of freedom. They would always say like contamination, like some disease. What Rosling found out that people usually said was very primitive things. He said in his book, these fears are still constructive for people on levels 1 and 2. It's because a lot of our fears, normally, even if you're watching this video, right, you're probably, I assume you're on level 4, and you still have these fears, because our brain, even though our body evolutionized, our brain never did. Well, it did slightly. But we still get these very primitive fears, right? Back when we were hunter-gatherers, we used to go out in the wild, and what we'd be scared of? Animals attacking us, right? Other humans attacking us, tribes. That's our nature. We are tribes. We are tribesmen. What are we afraid of? Disease. Because disease are these infinitesimally small, minuscule particles in the air. Bang up the vocab real quick. But yeah, it's just these things that we are afraid of. And most of the times, right? I'm not saying these are not common, like level 1 and level 2, people still endure these things, but these are fears that many people may not need to have anymore, but we still do. And a quote that he used to describe fear is, fears that once helped our ancestors stay alive, today help keep journalists employed. Wow. Isn't that so counterintuitive how that worked? Isn't that so precise in his language? Because that's exactly true, right? All these news articles about a bear killing a man, right? Stuff like that. Like stuff that we are truly afraid of are the things that get the most titles. But realistically, what are the chances that a man get killed by a bear, right? These days, it's close to none. It's really unlikely for these kind of things to happen. But it's just our primitive minds that get contracted to these kind of news articles that really make journalists like well known, you know? And a lot of the times they're really overstating the very simple. What Hans Rosling said in this book was that when we fear, we can't think straight. When we fear about these primitive things, it really distorts our worldview. And the thing we need to do is to rationalize. Realistically, how many people die by like being killed by a bear? How many people die by disease? Right? We did have the COVID-19, but we're gonna get on to that topic in the future. And yeah, what he said was very poignant. It's very good. So, as always, I'm going to present a question that Hans illustrated in his book and in the Factfulness quiz that he done. Question 7, up on the board. How did the number of deaths per year from natural disasters change over the last 100 years? A, more than doubled. B, remained the same. And C, more than halved. The answer is C, more than halved. And wow, when I read this question, I got this one wrong. I thought it was more than doubled. Because I think about the 2004 tsunami. It was an Indonesian tsunami. It was absolutely mad, right? You think about it so much. I think about Japanese earthquakes, right? Like, these things are the things that are reported from day-to-day life, because these are the things that are actually rare. That's why they get so much traction when they're reported in the media. And journalists really capture on these kind of things, and it shows you all the details about how the people are dying, how the people are fleeing, how the people are suffering under these circumstances. And think about it, 50 years ago, we didn't even have the power of communication, right? People would not have known if a tsunami happened in Antarctica, right? Stuff like that. We know now. It's the power of technology that really enhances the fear in our lives. Realistically, we have better hospitals, we have better aid, we have the WHO, right? We have all these amazing voluntary organizations that help out with these people. We have the best nurses, best doctors, we have the best specialists in the field compared to 50 years ago. But the only thing is that it gets more reported. These things are primitive fears of natural disasters, gets more reported. And since it's a primitive fear, we'd be like, oh my God, damn. That's scary, you know? So like, I chose more than doubled. I'm sure many people did as well. Because it truly seems like it more than doubled. I'm not saying I'm 50 years old or something. But, you know, it really does. Like, but we need to look at it with a factual, fact-based, data-based, figure-based worldview. And of course, only 10% of the people are smarter than Chimp. Or, saying it another way, 90% of the people got it wrong. Peak. Alright, last. I really want to illustrate how we differentiate fear from danger. How do you know that something is a fear, something that's not gonna materialize, and danger, which is actually like something we should fear? I'm gonna use an example. I'm going to illustrate what Hans Rosling said in his book. So I'm going to speak on, I'm going to recite what he wrote on his book. This chapter has touched on terrifying events. Natural disasters, which account for 0.1% of all deaths, plane crashes, 0.001%, murders, 0.7%, nuclear leaks, 0%, and terrorism, 0.05%. None of them kills more than 1% of the people who die each year. And they still get enormous media attention. We should of course work to reduce these death rates as well. Still, it helps to show just how the fear instinct distorts our focus. To understand what we are truly scared of, and how to truly protect our loved one from danger, we should suppress our fear instinct and measure the actual death tolls. Because frightening and dangerous are two different things. Something frightening poses a perceived risk. Something dangerous poses a real risk. Paying too much attention to what is frightening than what is dangerous, that is, paying too much attention to a fear, creates a tragic drainage of energy in the wrong directions. And yeah, that's very true, right? Like, we're spending a lot of time thinking about fear as danger when we really shouldn't be categorizing them in that way. And that's what's so powerful about what Hans tells us. These things that we think are actual dangers, plane crashes, murders, terrorism, natural disasters, they don't occur as often as you seem. They're only specially reported. Right. Now, I'm going to talk about number 4. The size instinct. Or, what does it mean? To minimalize. 2 words. To minimalize. I'm gonna tell you about Rosling's story in Vietnam. So right now, imagine it's like you're traveling to Vietnam, right? If I asked you what is the most well-known conflict in Vietnam, what would you respond? Surely the Vietnam War. Right? Surely everyone would say the Vietnam War because it happened in the span from 1965 to 1975, and it's the most recent and most tragic, one of the most tragic wars that we ever seen. And driving down the boulevard, you go to Vietnam, and you would expect to see this massive commemoration, memorabilia, right? But there's none. There's a tiny square that says Vietnam War, 1965 to 1975. Then you drive down the road, you drive down the boulevard. Then you see a much bigger, plaque in the center. And what's written on there? The French takeover of Vietnam, which happened 200 years ago. And it was under French rule for 200 years. That had a bigger plaque. Then you drive down the boulevard to the center of the city. Then you see this massive stone, beautiful, polished, white marble plaque. And on top, written, the people who died who fight against the Chinese. And the Chinese-Vietnamese War has been going on and off for 2,000 years. And this story really told Rosling, and it should tell everyone, about size. About how we only look at the surface. We only look at the tip of the iceberg. We see the Vietnam War, but we don't see how time affects the history of Vietnam, right? It's been under French control for not just 10 years, the Vietnam War, but 200. It's been fighting the Chinese for 2,000 rather than 200 or rather than 10. And you look how it builds up dramatically. And that's the size instinct for you. You can't look at the world, right? Like, if a man was here and he looks at the book would be massive. But then, there's a much bigger microwave of that, right? It would think the book is bigger than the microwave because of where it's standing. We need to look at everything from an eagle-eyed perspective. That is key. I want to tell you another story. What Rosling really said in this chapter was to compare and divide. Right, you might ask what that means. Well, I'm going to illustrate a story for you that totally explains what he means by comparing, then dividing. So basically, this is a story about an Indian foreign ambassador. At the 2009, there was some global, we're going to tackle global warming conference, right? Held by all the nations came, and how the West, one of the Western nations stood up and spoke about how India and China are contributing to most of the CO2 emissions and how they should stop, right? Which seems factual on the surface level, but the Indian expert, in contrast, could not sit still. He waved his arm and could barely wait for the moderator's signal that he could speak. He stood up. There was a short silence while he looked into the face of each panel member. His elegant dark blue turban and expensive-looking dark grey suit, and the way he was behaving in this moment of outrage confirmed the status that he was one of India's highest-ranking civil servants with many years of experience as a lead expert at the World Bank and International Monetary Fund. He made a sweeping gesture towards the panel members from the rich nations and said loudly and accusingly, "It was you, the richest nations, that put us all in this delicate situation. You have been burning increasing amounts of coal and oil for more than a century. You and only you pushed us to the brink of climate change." Then he changed his posture, put his palms together in an Indian greeting, bowed, and almost whispered in a kind voice, "But we forgive you, because you did not know what you were doing. We should not blame someone retrospectively for the harm they were unaware of." Then he straightened up and delivered his final remark as a judge giving his verdict, emphasizing each word slowly, moving his raised index finger. "But from now on, we count carbon dioxide emission per person." If you didn't get what the story meant, it was because India and China had a much bigger population. And first, you really need to compare how the carbon dioxide emissions for India and China compared to the Western nations when they were developing nations, right? Not developing nations, nations on level 3, level 2, right? And you really look at how the Western nations really emitted CO2 and how it led to this process of discovering how it was a problem. It was the Western nations. But what they were ignorant about was the damage they caused. If you look at the number of people in India and China, it's basically a factual that they need to use up that amount of CO2 because they have so many people. If you compare the divide by the number of people per country, you could see that the person uses probably like 4 times less CO2 than an average American. But it does not show because America has like 4 times less people, right? Which is exactly the issue we're trying to illustrate right now. You got to see the bigger picture, then you got to divide to see the smaller picture. That's a powerful story about size that Hans Rosling tells you, tells me, tells everyone. I love it. Right. To sum up this chapter, I'm going to go to question 7. Boom, on the board right now. Which map best shows where the 7 billion live? Boom, shows the maps on the board. The answer is A. The pin code is 1114. What does that mean? That the world's population is no longer centralized in the West or centralized in other places that we get misconceptualized about. It's really centered in Asia. And that really reflects the story I posed a while ago, right, about the Indian man. And it's crazy how the statistics really evoke how the world is really perceived. Only 30% of the people got it right. Only 30% of the people are smarter than Chimp. That's the harsh truth, right? How can we have these politicians who don't even understand how the world really works? They're not really wrong in their ignorance. They're just unattentive. They don't go down to the facts. And when these politicians don't do it, do you expect the normal people to understand? And that's how important it is to have a size instinct, to minimalize, to look from everything from an eagle-eyed perspective and be like, okay, that's how it really is. Alright. The last one. And I think this is similar to the fear instinct. The urgency instinct. To be unnecessarily panicking. Let me draw a quote from the book Factfulness. It needs systematic analysis, thought through decisions, incremental actions, and careful evaluations to determine whether fear is genuinely true. I couldn't have phrased it better. It does take all of those steps to find out whether what you are afraid about right now, what you are urgent about, what you really want to tackle as a problem is really as terrible as perceived. Of course, it's great to take action, but you can't just take blind action. You can't just take action without looking at the data, without looking at the facts. And that is what is so powerful about Hans Rosling's message. You got to look at the facts, then you determine whether there's really a problem. In question 13, boom, on the board right now, Hans Rosling writes, in the next 100 years, the average temperature would A, get warmer, B, remain the same, 3, C, to get cold. I'm glad most people got this one right. And as we are all taught in geography nowadays, I'm not trying to stereotype, maybe people are watching from much older years, but we are taught for the past 20, 30 years about the average temperature going up, which is good, because most people, I would say, are smarter than Chimp, which is bingo, which is exactly what we want. But they really need to teach the other stuff that is mentioned in this book. What this book illustrates was that the reason why they teach all of this is to create a fear. Was to create a fear that the world is one day going to perish if we don't take action. Which is fair enough. It is true. But that's really the wrong approach. If you approach something with fear, the only thing you're going to have is a clouded mind. It's not clear because your mind is stacked with this kind of tense, this kind of fight or flight situation. You don't want that. You want to tackle a problem logically, rationally, and specifically. You can't tackle a problem just by being fearful. That's not the motivating drive that can really get us far. The motivating drive is our analysis. It's thought through decisions, incremental action, and careful evaluations. That's how the world should be perceived. That's how politicians should really attack the problem. But they don't, because they said we need to create a fear. We don't need to create a fear. We need to destroy misconceptions so we can actually tackle a problem. And why do I think I trust Hans Rosling and everything he says? Because Hans Rosling predicted COVID-19. Bro predicted COVID-19. Bro said, despite everything that's scary in the world, what's the 5 things that are most scary that he knows that is going to happen in the future? Let me illustrate Hans Rosling's story. He died in 2017. This book was published after he died, 2018, right? Bro wrote in his book that the most scary thing that could ever happen to human race was a global pandemic. And COVID came in 19, that's why it's called COVID-19. This book, published 1 year before COVID-19, predicted how it's going to shape our world for the next potentially like 20, 30 years. This economic downturn. And guess what he mentioned as his second one? An economic collapse, a financial collapse. Because he's seen it so many times. This guy knows what he's talking about. He knows what to actually be fearful about, how to expect danger compared to blindly fearing something that might not happen. You see, COVID-19 is a much more imminent problem compared to climate change, even though they're both dangers. But we need to differentiate the fears. This man's a great man. I got to the end of the story, but I really just want to say, Hans Rosling knows what he's talking about. Hans Rosling was a man who grew up in 1948 in Sweden, and he worked as a medic in Africa. He worked as a medic in South America, in Europe. He taught at an institution. He worked with all these professionals. He's friends with Bill Gates, right? This guy's a true winner. This guy truly knows what he's talking about. That's why I respect him so much. And it's such a joy to present to you Factfulness by Hans Rosling. I really hope you got just a bit more out of this book about who am I, who is Hans Rosling, what is Factfulness from this talk. And I really recommend you to read it because I didn't give a full summary. I give a very detailed summary about what I think is best. But as perception is, as that may not be factual towards everyone, I suggest you could read the book as well. It's a great book. And yeah, that's it. If you watched this far, you're absolutely amazing. I actually can't imagine. I couldn't imagine someone watching this far. But yeah, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Love you so much. Goodbye.